Skoda. Simply clever.
In my Poland video, I set up a poll to decide which country to cover next. And this poll showed that people do not understand the concept of a two-option poll. Anyway, Czechoslovakia won by a kilometer, so that's what we'll be covering today. Every potential ground vehicle Gaijin could add to a Czechoslovak tree in War Thunder. War Thunder Czechoslovakia would be proud. But first, a history lesson. Czechoslovakia was during the interwar period one of the largest arms producers and exporters in the world. And for a couple of years, even the largest. In 1938, something called the Sudeten Uprising happened. An uprising of the Germans in Czechoslovakia provoked by Hitler. Shortly after, Germany took most of the well-fortified borders of Czechoslovakia and called it Sudetenland. And after that, Hitler was completely satisfied, and there would be no need for further conflict. No, really, he said so. Maybe this guy is not so bad. I sure hope he does nothing too radical. And then he started the deadliest conflict in human history. The Wehrmacht very quickly seized control, and the Czech part of Czechoslovakians were forced to make tanks for Germany. This is where vehicles like the Panzer 35 and 38T come from. Czechoslovakians were considered Untermensch, or subhuman by the Germans. And Czechoslovakia ultimately lost well over 300,000 people. Almost all civilian, mostly Jewish. After the war, Czechoslovakia was reunited again. And all was good. In 1948, the Soviet Union the Czechoslovak government into becoming communist, and Czechoslovakia became a satellite state of the USSR under the Warsaw Pact. In 1968, the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia regardless, because they were just bored or something. In 1989, the Czechoslovaks held a non-violent revolution called the Velvet Revolution, and Czechoslovakia became an independent democracy again. Shortly after which, on January the 1st, 1993, Czechoslovakia peacefully dissolved into the Czech and Slovak republics we know today. Now, how should Czechoslovakia be added? This time, I don't think there's much of a discussion here. Czechoslovakia needs their own tree. They have so much stuff. In fact, Czechoslovakia has so many vehicles that I'll be dividing this into two parts. This is part 1, in which I'll cover United Czechoslovakia, from the early interwar period to when it dissolved in 1993. Part 2 will cover the stuff from the Czech and Slovak Republic after they had their divorce. Don't worry, there is plenty of ground to cover for both. For your idea, the EU as a ground tree currently has about 120 vehicles. Poland, which we covered last time, could get over 170 vehicles. Czechoslovakia could get over 250 vehicles. This is why it took so long for me to make this video. All research is now done though, so next part should come out quicker. There is one teeny tiny problem, and that is that Czechoslovakia doesn't have a ton of top tier options. SPAA at top tier is covered, and you get some very good light tanks as well, but for proper tanks you're mostly still stuck with the Leopard 2A4. Having said this, Czechia already ordered a bunch of Leopard 2A8s, and Slovakia is interested in those and more as well. It might take a couple years for these to be delivered, but that would definitely still be sooner than us getting a Czechoslovak tree. Besides, 1 or 2 subtrees would eliminate this problem pretty much entirely. So I'm still all for Czechoslovakia getting their own tree. Most of the stuff we could get would be completely new as well, so it'd be a monumental waste to limit Czechoslovakia to just a subtree. Even if Gaijin seems to think otherwise, seeing as they're adding a bunch of Czechoslovak vehicles just to Russia. Speaking of which, I'll first mention the stuff we, of course, already have in game. There are a handful of vehicles, the M53-59 Praga, and the T-72 M2 Moderna for ground, and the Su-25K and Mi-24D for air, with the L-39 Albatros to come next update at 6.7. Somehow. Apart from the Praga, all these vehicles are event or premium vehicles, so there should be no problem transferring these to a new tree. Technically, the BVP 501 counts as well, as they were upgraded by the Czechs to Swedish standards. There are Czech voice lines in the game already for the Praga, and as usual for these smaller countries, they're just meh at best.
Posádko na pozice! Cíl zasažen! Cíl zasažen!
Funnily enough, there were also Czech voice lines in the game before the major crew overhaul, even though at that time there weren't any Czechoslovakian vehicles in the game.
Střelec je omráčený! Střelec je v bezvědomí! Střelec je omráčený! Střelec je v bezvědomí!
Again, as usual, these were considerably better than the ones we have now, though still far from great. The Slovakian Moderna is still stuck with Russian operators, sadly. There are a decent number of decals for these countries though. We have the roundel for the Czechoslovak Air Force, the Czechoslovak Army, you can't get this one anymore. The 313th Squadron, can't get this one either. The 1st Czechoslovak Armored Brigade, also can't get this one anymore. The Slovak Air Force, Slovak Resistance Air Force, the Slovak World War II Armed Forces, and the later Slovak Armed Forces. For Czechia, we also get a number of texts in Czech. There will be a handful of gibberish names in this video that I will try my very best to pronounce, but if you're not happy with how I pronounce them, then that is really too bad. There are actually a ton of suggestions and custom trees for Czechoslovakia. I used the one from Tadamat in the forums, the tree from Pickpicker, and another one made by Kate, though there are many more. I of course also want to thank the people in my Discord once again for helping me with research. In particular, I want to thank Pattern this time, who not only posted almost every vehicle suggestion in my server, but also personally checked and corrected my entire vehicle list. So if you still think I missed something or got something wrong, blame Pattern, it's his fault, he did it, get it! Links to all these tech trees I used, as well as my Discord, will be in the description. Now, let's get to the vehicles. And we'll start with looking back at Poland to make some corrections. I already made a ton of corrections in a previous video, so this will be very short. If your brain is so fried that you can't wait a couple seconds, you can skip ahead to here. I have to make some corrections on the Leopard 2 Pt.1. I said it got a better CITV as well as better protected ammo racks. It does get the improved CITV, but apparently the ammo rack thing isn't true. It does however get better turret electronics as well as some other minor improvements. There has been some discussion whether or not the T-34-85 M2 had a heat FS shell or not. And the book I mentioned in the video has been found by a couple of people. The book describes a shell that could be interpreted as a heat shell, but it almost certainly isn't. Sorry. For the rest, I might have still confused the PT-91 with the T-72 M1Z, but I honestly couldn't tell you for sure. They're both identical, pretty much. Alright, Czechoslovakia. They actually had a number of stuff from other countries, so we'll get those out of the way first. There was a Czechoslovak tank regiment set up in England to help the fight against the Nazis, and they used a handful of allied vehicles after the war as well. There isn't too much interesting here. They used most major British tanks, as well as 75 Shermans. Some noteworthy vehicles are the Mark IV Hummer, which we don't have in game yet, the Morris LRC Mark I and the Universal Carrier, both armed with 14mm voice rifles, though I'm not sure how good these would be in game, and also the Churchill 5 and Cromwell 6. Both armed with 95mm howitzers, and not in the game either. Czechoslovakia used a ton of Soviet vehicles as well, and after the diplomatic persuading, produced quite a bit also. These are pretty much the same ones I named in the Poland video, so all of those, give or take. The domestically produced ones have different names, but they're almost entirely identical apart from some very minor visual changes, like the road wheels or welding being slightly different. You know, like really autistic stuff that you really wouldn't have known if I hadn't just told you. One thing I should clarify is that the domestically produced BMPs were renamed to BVP, but again, they're completely identical. Czechoslovakia did dress up one of their T-34s as a Tiger I for a parade, and I believe a movie as well, which would be pretty funny to have in game. I mean, Germany gets their war crime machine, why can't everyone else get theirs? Czechoslovakia did also capture a handful of Garford Putilov armored cars, like the one we just got in the World War I event. Both Allied and Soviet vehicles we really don't need too many of, and I think these should just be used to fill in gaps in the tree. Next up, I want to talk about Germany and their vehicles, as there are a number of vehicles that were either made by Czechia for Germany, or made by Germany using Czech parts. Seeing as they were supposed to be used by the Germans, or in many cases were actually used by the Germans, I think these should go to the German tree, and Gaijin seems to agree. The Panzer 30AT NA is already in the game and in the German tree, despite being fully Czech built. There's definitely some other fun stuff that could be added, like the Aufklärungspanzer 38T mit 7.5 cm KWK 37 L24, Rams of Grog. It's an open-top Hetzer armed with a short 75mm howitzer, which is I. The same type of Hetzer was also armed with a 20mm flak and the same 150mm howitzer as the Sturmpanzer II. The Grille was armed with a 30mm, and these were captured and used by Czechoslovakia after the war as well. This is a Grille, by the way. The Skoda T15, which, yes, is the same Skoda that makes the fucking Octavia. And I will mention this company a lot more. You know, it's pretty interesting how pretty much all really old car manufacturers made military vehicles at least at one point in their lifetime. Anyways, the Škoda T15 was a joint German-Czech design very similar to the later 38T NA, with 5 vehicles built. There are more designs like a strengthened headster and vehicles like the Martyrs. I'm not gonna name them all here. Czechia also produced Panzer IVs, which were often hybridized by combining parts from different types of Panzer IVs. I don't think they did anything too crazy with it though. In general, Czechoslovakia got their hands on a lot of German tanks. A lot by capturing them after the war, and also because Slovakia kinda sorta fought alongside the Germans. After the war, Czechoslovakia had pretty much every major type of German tank. They had a good number of Panthers, Nashorns, various earlier Panzers, and even a couple of Tigers, including one Tiger II. Again, I really don't think we should get too many of these. I'm personally mostly against captured vehicles, as they often just make individual trees less unique. Besides, most of these captured German tanks were never actually used in service. There are, however, some very interesting domestic post-war designs and prototypes based on German vehicles, which I will mention later in the video. Czechoslovakia, as previously mentioned, was during the interwar period one of the largest arms producers in the world, which means they had a ton of fun domestic designs as well. Normally, I'd first go over the medium and heavy tanks, and after that the light tanks. The problem, however, is that this early in tank designs, there wasn't a lot of discrepancy between light and medium tanks, and both could be placed in either line. So for the sake of the video, all these interwar tanks I'm going to cover in a somewhat chronological order instead, as that is just way more comprehensive. One last thing I should note is that I won't be covering absolutely every vehicle, as I will be deliberately leaving out any export vehicles, as I think these should instead go to the nation that actually used the vehicle in question. Exception to this are vehicles that were made for export but were never actually exported. Besides, pretty much all of these export designs are just slight alterations of vehicles we would get anyway, and there are a lot of those to go through. I could do this all day though. The LTVC-34 was the first domestic design in service. It's, as you can imagine, very similar to the Panzer 35T in-game, but it gets weaker armor, only 3 crew members and a different running gear. The Škoda Š1 SPO was designed more inspired by the Vickers tanks, overall having similar armor and mobility as well, but being armed with just a 15mm machine gun. The Škoda Š2 was just a prototype as well. It has just 15mm of armor and can reach up to 30 km/h. It was originally armed with a 47mm gun, but this was later swapped for a 37. The Škoda Š2A, also known as the LTVC-35, should be very familiar. This is the Panzer 35T we have in game. The only difference is in that in Czechoslovak service it only has 3 crew members instead of the 4 for the German version. The Škoda Š2AJ, also known as the Škoda T12, was a modified LT-35 made for Yugoslavia, but they never bought them. It gets a 47mm instead of the 37. The Škoda T13M was a prototype for a modernization for the LT-35, getting a better engine and armor, and a better 37mm gun. The P2A was a competing design to the LT-35, made by the company Českomoravská Kolobň, also known as just GKD, and in this game would be functionally identical. The P2B uses a slightly different turret. The Škoda Š2B was a competitor to the P2B again. Only one prototype was made out of construction steel, it didn't pass the necessary tests and it was disassembled. No pictures exist, sadly. Both companies banded together after this though, and they created the Škoda GKD SP2B, receiving up to 30mm of armor and having a 47mm gun, though this was likely never actually mounted to it. The Škoda Š2C, also known as the Škoda T21, was a significant upgrade over the LT-35, being basically the predecessor for the Turan 1. Compared to the Turan, it gets significantly worse protection and firepower, but it is faster. Germany did order another prototype called the Škoda T23, basically being an up-armored T21. Next up, the old famous LTVC-38, also known as the Panzer 38T in the German tree. Of course the Germans used these a ton, but Czechoslovakia did also use these during, before and after the war. There are several versions, but the only notable modification is the F version, which we already have in game as well, getting significantly better armor. Based on the LT-38 is the LTL, though it gets a different armor layout and is now armed with a 20mm gun. The LTL was offered and rejected by Lithuania, and instead was used by the Slovakians, who renamed them to the LT-40, also rearming them with 37mm. The ST-VZ-39, also known as the V8H, was designed, again very reminiscent to the Turan, now equipped with a 47mm gun. Two vehicles were made, but they never entered production. There was a modified version of the V8H made for Sweden, called the V8H SV. It would have a different running gear, more reminiscent to that of the LT-38, as well as significantly better armor, up to 60mm. One prototype was partially completed, with the better armor, but still the old legs. But Sweden lost interest in the vehicle as they were making their own designs now. The Tatra T3 was the design for a medium tank. This was just a prototype again though. 2 hulls and 1 turret were completed, but the design was rejected in favor of the Škoda S3. The Škoda S3 had up to 32mm of armor and a 47mm gun. It could only go up to 25 km per hour though it did have the same speed in reverse as well. 2 prototypes were made, the S3-6 and the S3-8, having a 6-cylinder or 8-cylinder engine respectively. Okay, that was all of those out of the way. I hope you were able to follow that decently. Let's move on to some post-war designs, starting with an extremely interesting vehicle, and one I really hope we get someday. Introducing the Tiger 1, but not just any Tiger 1. This was a project to arm a captured Tiger with the Škoda A18 75mm gun. This gun would be comparable to that of the Panther, but it also had a 5-round magazine autoloader. So the first 6 shots you would be able to dish out faster than I dish out punches to my family, whenever I hear that the next update will, yet again, not include a Benelux country. However, there is no definitive proof that this thing was ever fully made. The gun was made for sure, and it was almost certainly fitted to at least the turret of the Tiger 1. But knowing Gaijin, unless it becomes a $60 premium, this is not good enough for it to be ended. The TNH-57-900 was a very interesting project to mount a 57mm autocannon, similar to that of the ZSU-57-2, in effectively an up-armored LT-38. The full vehicle was sadly never built, but a Panzer 38T NA was used as a demonstrator for the chassis and suspension. For the rest, there are some T-54 and T-55 modifications. The T-54M gets the T-55's gun, as well as a better engine. The T-54AR Zeka is equipped with a snorkel that could rapidly be used to, well, snorkel. Again, knowing Gaijin, this would likely be just a cosmetic change, but if not, it would be really cool to actually be able to go through a river with a snorkeling tank, even though it has absolutely no practical application. The T-55AM-1, not to be confused with the T-55AM-1, is just a T-55 with a laser rangefinder. The T-55AM-2 is a T-55AM-1, the AM-1 that is, but with a slightly different gun and worse armor. Very cool, Czechoslovakia. T-55 Dyna is a prototype, a T-55 AM-2 with the add-on armor replaced with ERA, as well as getting additional ERA on the roof. That was it for that already. Let's look at some proper light tanks now. First are a couple more interwar vehicles. Czechoslovakia used the Renault FT-17. I doubt we'll ever get this thing, as it would be nearly unusable, but hey, we did just get a bunch of WaifuOnTracks tanks, so who knows. The Škoda Praga L is a decently conventional 4x2 armored car, with a small turret armed with a 37mm, and a machine gun facing the opposite side. Next, let's look at the Kolohausen gun, or KH-60 series. These are a series of prototypes based on the KH-50 artillery tractor. The interesting thing about this thing is that it's tracked, but also has deployable wheels, which there are a number of designs of from the interwar period, but we don't have any in-game yet. On tracks, this thing can only reach 15 km per hour, but on wheels, a more manageable 35 km per hour. The first version was made from simple construction steel, and it was armed with a 37mm gun. The second version had actual armored steel, and a new more cylindrical turret, though still armed with the same good old 37. The third and last version saw another redesign of the turret, now with more angled sides, and would have been armed with a 47mm, though this gun wasn't actually fitted to it. Now for post-war vehicles. Starting out with the OA-971 Jarmila, a domestic 4x4 armed with a single recoilless gun, and a prototype for the OA-82 Jarmila 2, now armed with 2 recoilless guns. There are 2 versions of this thing, both having different armor layouts. The OT-65A was a joint project between Czechoslovakia and Hungary to place a recoilless rifle on a 4x4 as well. Czechoslovakia has a number of designs based on the OT-62, an amphibious tracked carrier, and APC based on the BTR-50. The OT-62 Vyšehrad is a prototype armed with a 23mm autocannon. The Vyšehrad 2 instead gets a 30mm, the same one as the Praga in-game, but just one this time. The OT-62 Grom is another version armed with the same 73mm gun from the BVP-1. The OT-64 is an 8x8 made by Czechoslovakia and Poland. The base version is armed with just a 14.5mm in a BRDM turret, but the Vyšehrad 1 version gets another 23mm instead, the same as the OT-62 Vyšehrad 1. Contrary to popular belief, the OT-64 cannot be armed with ATGMs. Lastly, there are some BVP modifications. The BP SV Svatava is first, being a modification of the BVP-1, getting more ATGMs and both a laser rangefinder and laser warning receiver. The BP SV Snieska is instead based on the BVP-2. This one loses the ATGMs, but gets thermals and more ammo for the 30mm in return. That was it for light tanks as well, I'm afraid. Czechoslovakia actually had a ton of really cool designs and projects that were never able to be completed just because communism. Not that there's nothing cool left. We're only halfway through just the Czechoslovak vehicles after all, but there are some interesting unfinished designs that I'll list down later. First, more real vehicles though. Moving on to the tank destroyers and artillery. Again, first going back to the interwar period. Starting with some wheeled vehicles, the Skoda 6 MTP6 6x6 truck was armed with a couple of guns. Firstly, the VC34 37mm, or just the LT35's gun. The same truck was also armed with the Z1 40mm gun, which would have been a surprisingly good anti-tank gun. The Skoda Pt.1 Gel is a very peculiar vehicle, a 4x2 casemate armed with a 75mm. Okay, back to track designs. Starting with the LK MVP projects. Two competing projects from both Skoda and Praga for a sort of gun carrier that would have been able to carry a 37mm gun that could be deployed like a field gun, but it can also be fired from within the vehicle. Both are very similar designs, just different chassis primarily. Both vehicles have very thin armor but a decent amount of crew, and the gun is placed in the back, so you would have to play this archer style. There are some other, more conventional, albeit small designs that could be added. There was a prototype based on the MU4 tankette, now armed with a 37mm called the Skoda S1D, not to be confused with the Skoda S1 capital D, which was a modified version made for Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia actually ordered another design, called the Skoda S1J, being a larger, more modern design, now armed with a 47mm. The prototype was deemed satisfactory by the Yugoslavs, and an order for 108 vehicles was placed, but these were never made as the VO requirements for Yugoslavia changed. Dickheads. Next up, the Skoda MU6. Not a crazy design, it's a prototype armed with a 47mm, it never really went anywhere. The Skoda PUV6 was a counterpart to the MU6. Again, just a prototype, a more open design, but now armed with the Z1 40mm gun. You could also remove pretty much all armor plating on this thing, allowing for a ton of controversy, but you have absolutely no protection. Now, more German designs. The ST1 are very simply captured hetzers that were repaired after the war. The G13 was a modernized hetzer meant for export. It had a better engine and now the same 75 as the Stug. I also have to give a mention to the PM1, a flamethrower tank built on the hetzer. There were a couple of prototypes. The later one uses a modified LT38 turret, but it never fully entered service. Only 60 hulls were ever completed. Something with the Geneva Convention or something. Oh wait, never mind. The OT-810D is of course based on the ST KFZ-251, though it gets a better engine and a larger crew compartment. It was armed with an 82mm recoilless rifle and a range-finding machine gun. It gets a gun shield for protection against small arms fire, and these can be folded down for significantly better gun traverse. The SHH VC1840N was a vehicle made originally for Germany at the end of the war, but it came out too late and the Czechoslovaks used them instead. It's a modified Hummel hull, please Gaijin, armed with the 105mm howitzer from the Wesp. Gaijin, please. A pretty cool cosmetic bonus of this thing are the mesh shields on the roof, designed so grenades would simply roll off. The VC1847 and Panther was a project to equip a Panther tank with a Soviet-style 152mm howitzer, as well as a heavy machine gun. It's pretty much just a Czechoslovak Lorraine 155. There are two designs, one with an open roof and another one with a closed roof, which was actually made. Sadly, we don't have any pictures, but there are records saying it was fully constructed. Czechoslovakia also captured a number of Turans from Hungary. Two of these were converted into SPGs armed with 105mm howitzers. Again, no pictures, but we have blueprints, so we know what they would have looked like. This thing was called the 105mm VC-18N Turan. The Pt.1 was a prototype based on the ATP tractor as a competitor to the OT-810D, with the same 82mm recoilless rifle. It of course never went anywhere, but the original vehicle still exists. There are more vehicles based on the OT-62. The OT-62B was actually in use and armed with another recoilless gun. There's also an empty version of the OT-62 with no weapons installed at all, instead just having a couple lads in the front holding RPGs. We don't really have handheld weapons in the game yet, as far as I'm aware. I don't see why it wouldn't work though. The OT-62 Topaz PTK was a prototype armed with a domestic 85mm. Very interesting. The BTR-50 PK Volant, you know, the BTR-50 the OT-62 was based on, uses the entire rear of the vehicle just to mount missiles. 8 to be precise. Volant missiles these are, and they're very heavily based on the malý. When I said that the OT-64 never had ATGMs, that wasn't entirely true. There is also a version with malý ATGMs in the back, but it loses the primary turret. Czechoslovakia also used the Soviet 9P148, a BRDM armed with 5 ATGMs. Again, not in the game either. Czechoslovakia used a handful of 2S7 Bions, another Soviet design, some modified T-80 chassis armed with a 203mm howitzer, which I would love to have in game. Next up, a very iconic Czechoslovak vehicle, the VC-77 Dana. Fully domestic, built on an 8x8 chassis, capable of going up to 80 km per hour. It has a 152mm howitzer with an autoloader, though not a very fast one, and that's about a 12-second reload. It can fire both HE and heat shells. There was an attempt to upgrade this thing called the Ondava, getting a new loading system and gun, but it never left the prototype stage. There are some rocket vehicles. Not sure how good these would be, but they could be fun. The V3S RM51 is a domestic design, armed with 32 140mm rockets. The RM70 uses a domestic Tatra 8x8 truck, and is the successor to the RM51. It is armed with a ton of 122mm rockets. There are actually a ton of versions of this thing, but they're all modifications like being on a slightly different chassis, or being able to carry a couple more rockets, or something else that I just couldn't be bothered to research. The only major variant is the RM70 Modular, as this one can carry other types of rockets as well, like 227mm ones, as well as the VMZ Krishan, now carrying double the launcher systems. For mortars, there isn't actually a ton. There's the Hako, a prototype taking an SD KFZ-251 and placing an 82mm mortar in the rear. Not sure if this would be any good though. K-Snake BOP. This bad boy is the SHM VC-85 Pram S, based on the BVP-1, now armed with a self-loading 120mm mortar, but like the good kind of autoloader this time. This thing gets a 3-second reload. Not only that, but it's also capable of firing Conker's ATGM from the same barrel. It also gets a 12.7mm NSV on top. Last but certainly not least, let's look at the SPAA. Starting out simple, the OT-810D was armed with a simple dishka. Not sure what else to add here. There's a gas 69 car with a double dishka. I mean, hell, we can double them again if you want. The LV-157 is a T-3485 armed with a quad dishka. The superstructure is just made out of wood though. There is no protection pretty much. There are more trucks. The Tatra 82 was armed with both a 50mm and a 20mm, and you can even fold down the sides for more range. The Soviet K-61 amphibious carrier was armed with a single 30mm, the same one as the M5359 Praga again, and again, just one. The same 30mm were used some more, like on the Soviet ZIL 485 amphibious 6x6, in Czechoslovakia renamed to BAV 485. This time it gets both 30mm. The Strop was a prototype, yet again armed with a double 30mm, this time on a BVP hull, but now also getting a laser rangefinder and target tracking. With how strong these 40mm are in the game already, with tracking I can imagine this thing being pretty damn strong against aircraft, and I for one love it. The Strop 2 is surprisingly unrelated to the first Strop. It instead uses the Dana body. It still has a 30mm with tracking and everything, but now also 2 Strela missiles. There are more versions of the M53-59 Praga as well, but all of these just seem to have like different muzzle brakes. Not sure how necessary these are. There's another prototype T-34AA, now armed with a single 57mm autocannon, very similar to that of the ZSU 57-2. It is very creatively called the T-34-85-57. Czechoslovakia did also kinda steal from North Korea's homework and armed their BVP-1s with manpads. These are again handheld though, but again, I don't see why this wouldn't work. The OT-64A can also have guys in the back holding Strela 2 manpads. Okay, back to more conventional designs, but not too much. These are all Soviet designs, but all of these we don't have in the game yet. There's the 9K31M Strela 1M, a BRDM-2 with 4 9M31 missiles, the 2K12 Kub, a design I've mentioned a couple times in previous videos as well. Next up, the 2K11 Krug. Rhymes of Grog. It uses a 2S3 hull and is armed with 2 860mm missiles. Okay, I want to put this into perspective real quick. Missiles from SAM systems currently in the game have an explosive filler of about 8 to 9 kilograms, on the higher end. The Sturmtiger's rocket has an explosive mass of 125 kilograms. The missile from the 2K11 has 150 kilograms of explosive mass, for if you just want to clear the entire sky in one go. These missiles can also go up to Mach 4 and reach up to 55 kilometers. Lastly, there's the S300 PMU, an 8x8 with 4 slots for a vast variety of missiles, ranging from 450mm to 1250mm in diameter, 130 to 150 kilos in explosives, 4,000 to 10,000 kilometers per hour, and with ranges from 40 to 400 kilometers. Now, these obviously need other vehicles to function, but we literally just got multi-vehicle SAMs, so that'll be no problem. And of course, these would be way too strong, and I really do not care. Now here I would mention all paper vehicles and unfinished projects, but after 250 vehicles, I hope you don't blame me for choosing not to research another 100 that will never be added anyway. So here's a quick slideshow of all the paper designs with the names in the bottom left corner. Wow, wasn't that amazing? Remember, these are all the vehicles from United Czechoslovakia. If you think a vehicle is missing, please make sure that it is from the great year 1992 or before. If it's from after that, I'll likely mention them in the next part. Next video I already have something else planned. After that I'll have to see, to be honest. I really want to cover Switzerland, seeing as they just got their airstream, and I want to pick up on that hype if possible, so hey, that might even be next video now that I think about it. I'll have to see though. For now, subscribe.